I mean, you are Karen, but I was expecting to see a back. All right, if you would please take your seats, we are about to get started. Well, good afternoon and welcome to the Claire Booth Luce Center for Conservative Women, where we empower young women to live happier, freer lives. My name is Kimberly Begg. I am the president of the Luce Center. This is a new role for me. I became president 2 months ago in March, but I have been involved with this wonderful organization since the 1990s. So I was involved with Luce as a student on my campus at Rutgers University, and I continued to be involved as a young professional, as a speaker, as a member of the board of advisors, and also the board of directors. Now, you may know that the Luce Center is the only conservative movement organization that specializes in educating and mentoring young women through internships, summits and seminars, campus lectures, and other programs. Our mission includes a commitment to promoting successful conservative women who can serve as strong role models for young women everywhere. Which brings me to the reason that we are all gathered here today, our May Conservative Women's Network Luncheon. Now, every month, we open the center to members of the community for this event, which is currently in its 24th year. Women from all over the DC area come to our monthly CWN events to hear from top conservative women leaders discussing important cultural and public policy topics. These events provide conservative women with much needed support, camaraderie, and friendship. This month, we are delighted to welcome Rachel Bovard. With over a decade working on Capitol Hill for both the House and Senate, Rachel has witnessed the challenges confronting conservatives firsthand. She is now the Vice President of Programs at the Conservative Partnership Institute. She served as the Executive Director of the Senate Steering Committee, which is the caucus of conservative senators chaired by Senator Mike Lee. She is the co-author with Jim DeMint of the book Conservative, Knowing What to Keep, which Mark Levin called a much needed force to unite Americans with positive ideas. Rachel's public policy expertise has been showcased through print and media appearances, including at Fox News, the New York Times, the New York Post, the Federalist, MSNBC, and more. Her impressive career has garnered her the American conservative magazine Conservative Mind Award and a spot on the National Journal's list of the 35 most influential women in Washington under 35 in 2013. In 2023, she was named to the Hill's list of the 25 staffers who make Capitol Hill run. So after Rachel's important talk, we are going to have time for Q&A. So we ask that you wait for the microphone to come around so that we can hear you, and we hope that you will join us for lunch afterwards. Please join me in welcoming Rachel Bovard.
Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for having me. Yes, I am 3 weeks away from giving birth, so I did ask for this chair for the Q&A section. But it's great to be with you. I've always wanted to be out here. I see a picture of my friend and colleague Cleta Mitchell on the wall, who works with me at CPI, so I already know I'm in good company. But what I want to talk to you about today is the fight that's facing us as a conservative movement, and I've titled this speech New Moment, New Movement. And so I'm really going to focus on what I think are the pressing challenges that are different than when I came to Washington, D.C. 16 years ago, and how we should respond to that. So, not to immediately stress you out with this topic, but as pressing issues go, saving the United States of America is the defining challenge of the young generation of conservatives today and probably for the rest of your life. This is a generational fight. It's an existential fight. And the biggest challenge the right faces, and this is different from, 15 or 20 years ago, it's not the Marxist left nor the elite establishment, toxic as they both are. Our greatest challenge is the failure or even the outright refusal of self-described conservatives to see what is actually happening to the country. The crises we face today on the border, in our city streets, online, in our classrooms, in our courtrooms, in the media, in Congress, and in our culture are completely different from anything we've ever witnessed. They are not the bungling inefficiencies and dysfunctions that have always been part, and will always be part, of every political system. And this is something we have to understand. Otherwise, no strategy we form or campaign we launch will do any good. George Orwell said, "To see what is in front of one's nose needs a constant struggle." So, as we undertake this struggle, what is in front of our nose today in May 2024? What do we see? An almost complete hostile takeover of America's taste-making and policy-shaping institutions by people who openly, unapologetically hate the United States of America. The new woke elite left, whatever you want to call it, despises the values of the vast majority of American citizens and recoils at the thought that we, the people, might run this country. They're trying every day with every institution they control and lever of power they grip to destroy our republic, our Constitution, the entire American way of life that made America great in the first place. It's unsettling to contemplate the idea that our ruling class doesn't just look down on us, they actually hate us. But understand, this is what they mean when they say they want to fundamentally change America. They believe America needs fundamental change because they believe America is fundamentally flawed. Conservatives are so accustomed to our own leaders' dishonesty that it's easy to dismiss the left's anti-American rhetoric as partisan claptrap. But unlike Republican leaders, the left means what they say. They truly think the nation we love, the nation we are, is immoral, racist, misogynistic, homophobic, transphobic, violent, cruel, superstitious, jingoistic, a confederacy of dunces. They think the American people collectively are the source of evil in the world, and so we can't be trusted to govern ourselves. So they're on a moral crusade to accumulate power and then insulate it from democratic accountability. So normally when you hear a conservative talk like this, especially in an election year, as we are in, it's a wind up to a campaign pitch. The left is so terrible. This is why you have to go out and vote Republican. But I'm here to tell you that's not enough. That's not nearly enough. And I'll go even further. If our generation of conservative women thinks that we will win this fight by voting for Republican candidates, then we've already lost. This is not a prophecy of doom. I'm not here to completely blackpill you. But the reason I come to events like this and the reason I do the work I do is that I know we haven't lost yet. Americans still have the power to stop the weaponization of our institutions and our slide toward post-constitutional servility. But to do so, the first thing we have to understand as conservatives, as women, and as Americans is that no one is coming to rescue us. No congressman or senator, no governor, no media celebrity, not even Donald Trump. And yes, it's an election year, but Republicans have had huge election years several times over the last generation. And the trends I'm describing have only gotten worse. Remember, the so-called Great Awakening reached its high watermark when Donald Trump was in the Oval Office and Amy Coney Barrett was already on the Supreme Court. The left's takeover of our public institutions continued apace under multiple presidents and multiple Congresses of both parties. The budgets for all the federal agencies that are now weaponized against the conservative movement and the American people all rose every year when Republicans had both ends of the Pennsylvania Avenue. But let's be fair. Not all Republican elites are bad people. Contrary to online conspiracy theories, they're not secretly left-wing ideologues, most of them. They genuinely dislike the left's capture of our institutions and the weaponization of government, and they sincerely look for opportunities to nudge policy an inch or two in a better direction. But the difference is this. Many of them fundamentally do not believe that our republic is disappearing before our eyes, so they can't be bothered to inconvenience themselves or critically to offend the establishment left and the media to right the ship. Most of you have probably heard of William F. Buckley's quip that the conservative's job is to stand athwart history yelling stop. It's a great line. It's a useless political strategy. It was formulated at a time when Democrats were what many of your political science professors probably called social democrats. Their New Deal coalition was proudly and patriotically American. They just believed in higher taxes and a more generous welfare state. But that's not what the Democrat Party is about today. Not the elites who call the shots, not the staffers who run the Biden White House, not the cultural Marxists who run our universities, teachers' unions, leading corporations, the deep state bureaucracy, or newsrooms. Their agenda is no longer just a higher minimum wage, labor union benefits, or more robust Medicaid options. They're for defunding police departments. They openly spout anti-Semitic lies. They say border security is racist. They're forcing young women to shower with and compete against biological men. They're colluding with big tech corporations to censor conservative speech. They pressure banks to deny loans and financial services to conservative borrowers. They groom school kids and encourage prepubescent children to mutilate their genitals. They put peaceful, pro-life grandmothers in jail while releasing violent criminals in the name of equity. And remember, these are not things we caught them doing. These are things they brag about. In the face of these horrors, every Republican in Congress is willing to yell stop, but few are willing to vote no. Adding a few more so that we have more R's than D's in the House and the Senate will not matter if Republicans continue to care more about their reputations than about the country. So that is ultimately up to us. If America is going to be saved, we are the ones that have to do it. But to solve this problem, we first have to understand it. It didn't start with Joe Biden or the Trump wars or drag queen story hours. It started a generation ago with America's victory in the Cold War. The conservatism of the Reagan era was almost as successful as its 21st century advocates say. It really did rescue the country from Jimmy Carter's malaise and stagflation, and it rescued the world from Soviet communism. The conservative movement of that era, as you've probably heard, is termed fusionism. Its famous three legs of the stool coalition consists of economic libertarians who wanted limited government and free trade, anti-communist foreign policy hawks who wanted to defeat Russia, and social traditionalists who wanted to protect biblical and family values from the cultural fallout of the 60s. Now, it must be said that this is not wrong. This is not a wrong approach at all. I agree with it. I believe in limited government, a strong national defense, and traditional patriotic values. But when you look back, fusionism was always more of a timely political coalition than a coherent political philosophy. It was an electoral response to the specific challenges presented by the Soviet Union. But there's a new coalition now, and it's designed around answering the political challenges we face today. Because today, smart, principled conservatives disagree that a strong national defense means an all or nothing focus on kinetic warfare around the globe. Instead, many of us believe it should focus on strategic, tactical insertions that have a clear connection to the American interest. In the same way, doctrinaire adherence to pure economic libertarianism fails to grapple with the corporate tyrannies that now threaten Americans' fundamental rights like speech and access to the market. In the 1980s, social conservatism meant things like protecting religious freedom and backing law enforcement agencies like the FBI. Well, today, the FBI targets religious Americans, like daily massgoers and Christian parents opposed to trans extremism. The FBI calls them domestic terrorists. So when establishment Republicans say that Ronald Reagan's defiance of Soviet communism means we have to fund the Ukraine war today or can't address big tech tyranny because they're private companies, or we should continue to freely trade with our communist enemy, China, they're grasping at invisible straws. Think about where we are in this political moment. Public schools are changing kids' gender identity without their parents' consent. The Biden administration is literally trying to imprison the presumptive Republican presidential nominee to prevent his election, and they're campaigning on it. Shoplifting and violent crimes are effectively legalized in many of our major cities, but a pro-life protester with no criminal history was just this week sentenced to almost 5 years behind bars. And like so many of the elite left's projects, these are all federally funded. They're being done with our money in our name. Establishment Republicans can and do claim success in changing the Supreme Court. But remember that it was the anti-establishment Donald Trump who put Neil Gorsuch, Brett Kavanaugh, and Amy Coney Barrett on the Supreme Court. It wasn't Mitt Romney. And even if we acknowledge the conservative establishment's role in creating the conditions to appoint such justices to the court, it still only strengthens the indictment against them. We should all celebrate, by the way, the 2022 Dobbs decision, which overturned Roe v. Wade. But note that ever since then, the pro-life movement has gone on a 2-year losing streak. The party and the movement establishment had 49 years to prepare for a post-Roe political strategy. They never bothered. And this is a pattern. Retiring Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell famously calls this strategy playing the long game. But if the strategy only involves 1 step forward and 2 steps back, you're not playing a long game at all. You're just losing. And today, everywhere you look, conservatives are losing. The Constitution is losing. Our nation is disappearing, and it's being erased by our own leaders. Culturally, fiscally, constitutionally, politically, strategically, we are further along the path to lawlessness and tyranny than at any time since the Civil War. And our GOP elites are utterly uninterested in fighting back. When you hear the elites, mostly on the left, but sometimes on the right, they scold conservatives about disregarding norms. And by this, they mean surrender. The future the left has in mind for us and our kids would mean an entirely new way of life. This new left doesn't care about norms, they don't care about the Constitution, and they don't care about civil rights. They care about power. They already have more than they have ever had, and they're acquiring more of it every day. And the only power they have not yet taken from us is our ability to do something about it, our ability to fight back. And so that's what we have to do because it is our only choice. Our only hope is to arrest America's slide into tyranny and revive its constitutional future. The left's Orwellian vision of the future can be stopped, but it's just that our Republican leaders aren't willing to do it. And this means we're in a new moment. And my thesis today is that it requires a new movement. We need leaders willing to face the tyrannical institutional left rather than hide behind the empty promise of future wins while basking in the Washington adulation of status quo governing. We need to stop pretending the left's smug expectations of our obeisance is the norm. It's a scam. The incremental compromise wins the GOP elites promise in exchange for our deference, they haven't come, and they're not going to come. With the left now wielding our $6 trillion, 2.2 million person weaponized federal government, those wins are not just around the corner. We have to fight back, and that requires us to go on permanent offense until the republic is once again safe. The first step to winning the war against the left's hostile takeover of American democracy is really simple, actually. It's to finally stop funding it. Congressional Republicans today fear being called obstructionists. They fear the phrase government shutdown more than they do the left's open commitment to despotism. As long as grassroots conservatives like us tolerate this cowardice, it will remain the defining feature of Republican congressional policymaking, and it will remain the principal source of our nation's decline. I'm not exaggerating. Just in the last few weeks, the Republican majority in the House and a majority of Republicans in the Senate agreed to a set of appropriations bills that paid for a full-term abortion clinic. They paid for the Biden DOJ and the FBI's Banana Republic lawfare against Donald Trump. They paid for a Department of Defense that spends its resources on DEI programming and abortion. They also paid to continue the politics and policies of a wide open southern border. They deemed it unseemly and frankly non-controversial to engage in funding fights. Under the quote unquote norms that we set for ourselves, the left always wins, and that's the entire point. The second thing we need to do is to stop the federal government from building and maintaining the machines bent on our destruction. America's universities, the ones you've seen on the news, the ones where they're chanting death to Jews and draping statues of George Washington and flags of Hamas, they get away with such behavior because we allow it. Colleges' billion-dollar endowments aren't taxed, and the federal loan system lines their pockets every semester with impunity. Congress has the power to end it, and they should. Next, we need to stop making the first Republican priority in every majority a tax package to benefit the corporate interests who hate us. We need to build a trade agenda that actually works for America, one where we're not, trading with our communist enemies and letting them into our corporations and our universities. We need to break up industry concentration and the private equity casino, which has reduced the quality and services of sectors ranging from banks to social medias to hospitals. We need to start controlled burns in the executive branch agencies that have become far too unwieldy and powerful for even a president to control. And finally, we need to accept that the age of American empire building is over. We have to craft a new foreign policy that is pragmatic, realistic, and sensible, the type of foreign policy espoused by Robert Taft, Clare Boothe Luce, Pat Buchanan, and even Richard Nixon. This is a global view which fiercely protects American sovereignty while engaging in tactical and targeted missions to protect American interests. It's the opposite of seeking out monsters to destroy and bogging down our troops and treasure in decades-long globalist democracy-building fantasies. Putting America first is not controversial. The left and the establishment pretend it is, just like they pretend border security and free speech and Christianity are controversial. They're not either. The 1,000 issues they try to rule out of bounds out of respect for norms is one big lie. And the Republican politicians who bow down to it are complicit in the lawless tyranny the left wants to impose on us. They stand athwart the left saying no, but voting yes. And that's not a strategy. It's not positioning. It's surrender. And they wave their white flag as long as we let them. So we have to stop letting them. Again, the media, the donor class, the party leaders, the campaign consultants, everyone else in their orbit will tell elected Republicans to join the surrender caucus. The only other voice that matters in their ear is the grassroots conservative movement itself. The only voice that matters is ours. And as powerful as the left is, as entrenched as the establishment is, we're not helpless. It's still our movement, and it's still our country. America's slouch toward Gomorrah is not inevitable, nor is it inexorable. That very few people in Washington are willing, are ultimately capable of fighting back is a tragedy. It's a calamity, but it's also an opportunity for us, for you, for the women of the new conservative movement that needs to start here today. I've been in this fight a long time, but as a mom of 2 very young Americans, it's different for me now. As an American, I'm fighting for my country like I've always been doing, but as a mom, I'm fighting for my kids, like many of you will be too. The new moment requires a new movement, and that has to start right now, right here with us. Thank you. As I was mentioning, I'm happy to take questions. I'm going to sit in this chair, but I'm happy to talk about not just the topics of the speech, but Capitol Hill or anything else that is on your mind.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. So what does that look like for me, for you, and for all of us sitting here? What does that mean? We can change things on Capitol Hill. So like practical ways that we can get involved to make the change.
I think the biggest thing is, one, your voice does matter. I think sometimes the grassroots movement gets taken up by this idea that, well, other people will do it, or, this group is saying this, so I should say this. We're not in a moment where your voice doesn't matter. And this starts with not only talking to your representative, but electing the right people, right? I think as a movement, we keep accepting the excuses. We just have to have, this is what I've heard from 16 years of working in politics. Well, we don't, so right now we have the split, right? We have a House Republican House and a Democrat Senate. Well, we don't have the Senate. Well, when we did have a Republican House and a Republican Senate, they'll say, oh, we don't have the White House. Well, we did actually a couple years ago have the Republican House, Republican Senate, Republican White House. And then what was the excuse? Oh, we don't have the Supreme Court. Oh, well, we have the Supreme Court. And then it was, oh, well, we don't have 60 votes in the Senate. We don't have 60 Republicans. We might have a Republican Senate, but we don't have 60 Republicans. Well, what happens when we have 60 Republicans? Well, then they say, oh, we don't have 60 conservative Republicans. So I think the idea is the reason I wanted to give this speech was that so we, as a grassroots movement, stop accepting the excuses. In my mind, the House Republican majority has no excuses for what they just did, none. And they'll say, oh, well, it's because the Democrats wouldn't have accepted it. Well, there's old political wisdom that traces its roots all the way back to the Roman Senate. There's a quote from Cicero that I'm going to butcher, but it's basically, you never know how a fight is going to end until you're in it. You actually have to try. You actually have to say to those Senate Democrats, and frankly to Mitch McConnell, who aligns himself a lot of times with those Senate Democrats, we're not funding your border policy. We're not funding the full-term abortion clinic that Tammy Baldwin put into those bills as an earmark. We're not doing it. And hold your ground. And I think the biggest thing too for the movement is that when we see people doing this, we have to celebrate them. Because the incentive structure of Washington is such that if you do those things, because again, those are the only things, standing up and saying no is the only thing that is going to stop everything I just described there. Because everything that we hate as a movement is literally funded by our federal government. So when the incentive structure in Washington is when you are the one saying no, the city wants to burn you to the ground, right? The political dailies write crap about you. Reporters will show up at your house. They'll show up at your kid's school. Your fundraisers will drop you. They will make it very hard for you to exist in Washington. Washington is an incredibly social town. And when they start isolating you and shaming you, it really works on a lot of these people. So they need to hear from us that, hey, no, this is what we want. You're doing the right thing. This is what I mean by using your voice. Using your voice to hold people accountable, but to also embrace the people who are doing the right thing and giving them an incentive structure to want to do it more. Does that make sense? Does that help? I think yes, and I think the more people that do that together helps, right? Organize in that movement. The majority of Senate Republicans voted for these bills. That's unconscionable to me. Right? There was a lot of Republicans in the House that voted for this too. You can't out of one side of your mouth say this is, what Joe Biden is doing is, tearing down the country and chest thump about it and write strongly worded letters and then literally vote for the bills that fund it. That's what we have to stop accepting. And I think we have a lot of organizations in the movement that can put their organized muscle behind it. But at the end of the day, it also depends on us being vocal about it.
Hey, Rachel. Do you have any stories from behind the scenes in the Senate? Because you just recently came out of a spell in the Senate and you've been all over Capitol Hill. But do you have any stories that maybe illustrate how bad it is? How unaware some conservatives, so-called conservatives, are unaware or even actually oppositional some conservatives are on Capitol Hill?
Yeah, I think probably the best way to describe this is kind of to give you a little bit of insight into how. So I've worked in the House and the Senate, but most of my career has been spent in the Senate. And I'm going to give you a little bit of insight into how decisions get made within the Senate Republican Conference, because I think it's instructive to how we end up where we are. So the Senate Republican Conference, I describe walking into the Senate as like immediately being on drugs, because it's like they're so detached from like the rest of America. Part of that's by design, right? The Senate, they have longer terms, like for this reason. They're supposed to be like the thoughtful chamber and all this stuff. But they really are like totally detached from concerns about that like things that normal Americans care about. But what's interesting especially is how decisions get made in the conference. So there's 49 Republican senators, so it's pretty small, right? You're dealing with a pretty small group if you think about it. And they meet for lunch 3 times a week in the Senate. The conference does together. So on Tuesdays, and I sat in one of these lunches because when I was the executive director of the steering committee, we run the Wednesday lunch. So that's the conservatives get to run that lunch, which simply means we sort of set the agenda for what we want to talk about. Senate leadership runs the Tuesday and the Thursday lunch, and we run the Wednesday lunch. It is not an exaggeration to tell you that lunchroom politics run that room. And this is really depressing because you revert back to high school. So you have members that come in and say, look, this is absurd that we're going to be funding this stuff. I demand an amendment on, defunding Planned Parenthood on this. I demand an amendment on defunding Title X abortion funding in the HHS appropriations bill. The leadership doesn't want to rock that boat. And so in front of all your colleagues, they'll tell you how stupid you are. They'll tell you how dumb that is. They'll tell you you politically don't understand, or they'll say, well, you know what, it's fine. We'll work something out next year. But just like, don't deal with it right now because it's something we have to do because Republicans can't own a shutdown. We don't want to do that. And the peer pressure is insane. And that's what runs these meetings. And so this is what I'm saying, like the best way to understand Washington, I've said this before, is the movie Mean Girls. If you've ever seen this movie, everybody thinks that DC is House of Cards. Like, it's like people murdering each other in like high level, like, strategic movements. It's not. It's like Veep and Mean Girls. But when I say mean girls, I mean like the social peer pressure of shaming people out of doing anything that rocks the status quo boat. And I'm really not kidding you that I've seen this happen to multiple members. If you push back against sort of the prevailing winds of, well, we need to fund this bill, we need to do this bill. If you start creating public problems, if you go out and publicly criticize your own leadership for doing these things, they'll call your fundraiser and they'll say, don't work with this guy anymore. And you have to raise money to be in politics, right? If you don't have the DC fundraiser setting up your meetings with donors and all this kind of stuff, it's really hard to stay in Washington. They will at times kick you off your committees. I've seen this in both the House and the Senate. It just happened this last go around. Rick Scott and Mike Lee, Rick Scott Senator from Florida, Mike Lee, Senator from Utah, were kicked off the Commerce Committee for voting against Mitch McConnell as leader. It's just this tit for tat, like high school level politics that takes over these institutions. And this is, if you aren't strong enough to withstand it, like you almost have to be dispositionally like an Iceman. like you can't have feelings. You basically have to be Rand Paul, right? Who just like doesn't care what other people think about him. He was my first boss in the Senate, and I can confirm that he really doesn't care. So unless you're like that and you just don't care, right? But most people aren't like that, right? Because think about the type of people we elect to office. They're dispositionally extroverts, right? They like people. They want to be around people. They've spent years and millions of dollars trying to get people to vote for them, which is effectively like liking them. So they are not naturally inclined to go in and disagree. And so the groupthink takes over. The groupthink takes over, and they all want to be. They all convince themselves that, well, we couldn't do it this time, but they're going to get me next time. And this is how we end in this just like inevitable slide where nothing changes except a little bit around the margins. And that is really what I'm getting at. That is what we have to stop tolerating, because that's how we've ended up where we are, is accepting slight marginal tweaks, slight policy changes, an inch or two in one direction as the massive wins that they are not. And the left capitalizes on that because they know we don't want to be the skunk at the garden party. And they make it so painful for the people who are. But unfortunately, we're in such a state that making it painful is the only way things are going to change. Was that a really depressing look behind the curtain?
Let me grab the mic for you. This will be our last question of the day.
I love your speech. I think you should give it to Trump to use in the debates. But I'm sitting here thinking that it's the lost cause when you're going to Congress for change, and that it has to be the president that makes these changes, that's where the power is to change these things. And I'm still stuck with, how do you change the minds of people who vote for the president? Because I live in Maryland, so most of the people I know are Democrats. And they say me as the stupid one, right? Because they are the elite, kind of person. So how do you change, how do you get to them or get through to them?
So I think to the first part of your question, you're not wrong, right? We have our executive is incredibly muscular, and Congress likes it that way to some extent. But what I will tell you is not to give up on Congress for this reason. This forthcoming spending process, so we're already in the middle of fiscal year 2025, right? We still have to pass appropriations bills before the end of the year. What Democrats are intending to do in those appropriations bills, unless they face robust action, like opposition from Republicans, is to hamstring the next administration. I don't know if you've seen, I think Wall Street Journal has written about this, a couple other newspapers. They call it like, I can't remember the exact phrase they used, but like anti-Trumping, like foreign policy funding, right? Or other certain agency funding. They want to tie the hands of the executive because that's how powerful Congress is, right? Congress controls the budgets of all these agencies, the spending. So like they are able to make policy and dictate to the agencies what to do. And so Congress does matter. They can, and this is I tried to make this point in the speech. They can stop the funding of everything that's happening here. The left's abortion agenda through the federal government, the lawfare through DOJ, the trans agenda AHHS. All these things are funded with our tax dollars, and that is controlled by Congress. So don't write Congress off completely. They're like useless in a lot of ways, but this is like a very important area. The second thing I would say too is that the president is incredibly muscular in what he can do with executive authority. But, and we saw this with the Trump administration, the agencies and the people that work there, they've shown us who they are. And there are simply not enough of us to stop them. So it has to be a Republican president working with a Republican Congress to control those people.
Thanks for the share, too.
Rachel, that was wonderful. Thank you so very much. Thank you all for being here today. We have lunch shortly. I have a parting gift for you. So this is a tradition at the Claire Booth Luce Center for Conservative Women. I have a Yeti mug with our favorite quote by Claire Booth Luce, which is, "Courage is the ladder on which all the other virtues mount." Thank you for your courage. Thank you for all you do. Thanks for being a part of our Conservative Women's Network luncheon. All right, let's give Rachel another hand of applause.